broken. Don't ever forget your golden.
Sometimes we experience something so horrible, so frightening or scarring or painful that its effects linger long after the experience has ended. Our traumas have a way of taking root in us and shaping us into people that we never wanted to be and were never meant to be. Trauma can devastate our sense of self and the way that we interact with the world. But is that the end of the story, or can our traumas be redeemed into something beautiful? Let's talk crisis. Hey guys, it's Eric with Aparche Ministries, and this week we're going to conclude our series on crisis. We're going to talk about trauma. Every single week of this series, I've been saying that Christians just don't talk about this stuff enough. I think that on the surface, it's just really, really dark. It's really ugly, and we prefer just to pretend like, hey, Jesus came to the earth and he died and was resurrected, and now things are just fine. Well, not yet. So that's going to happen, but not yet. So for now, it's important that we talk about this stuff. It's important for a lot of reasons. One, because Christians struggle with this stuff. Until Christian suicide rates hit 0, then this still needs to be addressed. It has to be talked about. And then the other piece of it is that if a world that exists in darkness and that struggles with these things, if the world is out there and people are out there in the world struggling with this stuff, and the church and Christians have nothing to say about it, then we are not doing our job in being the light of the world and the salt of the earth. All right, so it's really important that Christians talk about this stuff, and we're going to. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the giveaway. So we are giving away a Jesus-centered Bible at 100 subscribers. We're really excited about that. If you don't know what the Jesus-centered Bible is, look it up on Amazon, or go watch one of the other million videos where I talk about it. So all you have to do for that is just subscribe, and we're just giving it out randomly. Okay. We're putting out great content on social media every single day, multiple times a day. So if you want to be encouraged throughout the week and you want to experience something uplifting throughout the week, make sure you find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. On this video, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you can always see our videos when they come out, because we want you to be part of this whole thing. So, all right, so talking about crisis, look, it happens. Self-hatred happens, anxiety happens, depression happens, and yeah, trauma happens. And trauma, like everything else I've said, can take a lot of different forms and take a lot of different shapes. And there's no cookie cutter answer, no cut and dry answer to what exactly it is. I said it before in the intro that it's a situation or circumstance that's so incredibly painful or so incredibly difficult that it stays with us way after we're removed from that situation. I think a more spiritual, so that's the truth, and I think a more spiritual answer is that trauma is where the darkness of this world and the brokenness of mankind intersect in us, right? So trauma can come from a lot of different avenues, and so the darkness in the world might be something like, hey, I was in this horrible storm, or this earthquake, or like something really traumatic, something crazy like that. Or the brokenness of humanity, like I was abused, or somebody robbed me, or like those kinds of traumas. Those are real. And so we get traumas from the universe itself, this broken world, and we get traumas from human beings who are also broken. It seems like, for the most part, I'll never say always on that stuff, but it seems like for the most part, trauma comes from the outside, right? Trauma comes from the outside. To someone who's abused, it comes from the outside. To the service member who goes off to combat, it comes from the outside. If you witness something horrible, it comes from the outside, right? And most often, there are causes to our traumas. So for the abused, it's the abuser. For the person in combat, it's the enemy combatant, right? And that goes on both sides. But the enemy combatant is the cause of trauma. And if you witness something horrible, well, whoever perpetuated that horrible thing is the cause of that trauma. So it comes from the outside. And then the other piece of that is that it happens to everyone. You're not getting out of this life without some trauma. And I know, admittedly, that is not the most encouraging thing I could say. That's definitely not something that's going to build you up, but it's realistic. and we have to be realistic. The Christian approach to dealing with trauma can't be to just close ourselves off and pretend like it's not happening. It happens. People go through heinous and horrendous things, and they're forced to somehow continue their lives. Trauma happens. And it isn't just Christians that have a hard time displaying empathy for that. Like, we have a hard time kind of like relating to people who have big traumas, right? Everyone has that struggle. It's really hard to relate to people with big traumas. The difference is that Christians should be the most empathic people on the planet, right? And that's the shape I want this to take. And that's the direction I want to look at this from today, is that we should be the most empathic people on the entire planet. So let's look at trauma from a biblical standpoint. And right off the bat, I want to say this. There is a lot of trauma in the Bible, a lot of trauma. Like Jesus, right? So Jesus was betrayed. There's an emotional trauma right there. Jesus was obviously abused and mutilated and murdered. And that's a lot of physical trauma right there. So Jesus experienced lots and lots of trauma. And one thing that does for us is it says when we are experiencing trauma, God knows exactly what that's like. God has experienced trauma. But the thing about Jesus experiencing trauma is this: it's very specific. So it's really hard for me to relate to that and to say, yeah, Jesus experienced trauma, so I know it's going to be okay, because Jesus' trauma saved the entire universe. And that's like as redemptive as you could ever look at it, right? That situation turned around to the most beautiful thing, the ugliest situation, the crucifixion of a man who did literally nothing wrong and was the embodiment, the physical embodiment of love and God among us, right? To have him murdered, it was the worst, darkest moment in human history. And then it becomes the most beautiful thing, the most overarchingly powerful thing that it could ever be. And that is redemptive. That's extremely redemptive, but it's so specific. And it makes me really hard for me to relate and say, like, you know, my traumas are like that. Like I can experience them like that. So it's really hard to relate, and I don't necessarily think that it's apples to apples, right? Like, God completely understands our suffering because of it, but we can't really process our trauma because of it. So it's not necessarily apples to apples. But the Bible still has tons of trauma in it. So, like, that's like the biggest, most redeemed, most amazing trauma turnaround story. But we still have a lot to go on. And I'm going to focus on Paul. And I hate this. I hate that preachers often do this, that they'll push Jesus aside and highlight Paul. And I'm not doing that here. I just think that Paul's specific biography carries a lot more like applicable weight to our situation, right? Because we are not saving the world through our trauma, right? So we have other things going on. And so did Paul. So he writes this letter to the Corinthian church. It's his second letter, maybe his third letter, probably his third letter, but it's the second one that we see in the Bible. And he's writing here, he's basically defending his role, not the whole book, but in here, in chapter 11 and 12, he's defending his role as an apostle, because some people showed up in Corinth and tried to downplay who Paul was. They tried to kind of usurp his apostolic authority, and so he's defending his role as an apostle. And so he compares himself to these false apostles that the Corinthians have kind of like been following, and they're like bragging about their lives, right? And he says it's so foolish that they're doing this. And then for just a second he says, but you know what? I'm going to indulge them, and I'm going to entertain this foolishness. And if you want to brag, here comes the brag. Okay, so he says in 2 Corinthians 11:21 and on, he says, whatever they dare boast about, and I'm talking like a fool, right? So he's saying that it's foolish. Whatever they dare boast about, and I'm talking like a fool again, I dare to boast about it too. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they sons of Abraham? So am I. So one is his ethnicity, Hebrew. One is his nationality, right? Israelite. And one is his faith. Is he a son of Abraham? Yeah. Check, check, and check. So he says, are they servants of Christ? And he says, I know I sound like a madman, but I have served him more. And here comes the trauma. And Paul is using his trauma very specifically here. Here comes the trauma. I've worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. 5 different times, Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. Time out. So the old way of thinking was at 40 lashes a man would die. So for him to suffer the most is 39 lashes. That way he doesn't die and he's forced to recover from that. And also, if you have any big scars on your body and you suffer continuous trauma over those scars, it becomes more and more and more painful. So your back is only so big and lashing is only so accurate. So by the 5th time Paul suffered these lashes, it had to be just excruciating. Right? So trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I've traveled on many long journeys. I've faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I've faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from Gentiles. I've faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. I've faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I've worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. Jump forward to verse 30. And he says, I would rather boast about the things that show how weak I am than all those things that we just talked about. So moving forward, Paul starts talking about the fact that he's had many visions and revelations from God. And he could boast about those things. He could brag about those things, especially in his time. Consider this fact. Jesus came, walked the earth, died, resurrected, walked around a little while longer, then disappeared, and everyone was left to spread the message, right? And that was the end of interaction with Jesus, except for Paul. Paul continues to have interactions with Jesus. He has all this special revelation from God, and he could brag about this. And he says that in 12:5 here. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I will only boast about my weakness. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I'd be telling the truth. But I won't do it because I don't want to give anyone, I don't want anyone to give me credit, beyond what they see in my life and hear in my message, even though I've received such wonderful revelations from God. So he could be proud, he could be boastful, and it would only be telling the truth about the amazing things God had shown him and told him. But instead, he says, to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from being proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away, and each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I'm glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. And then he goes on to show how it can all be redeemed. He says, that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, in the hardships, the persecutions, and the troubles I suffer for Christ, the trauma I suffer for Christ. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So to summarize, because that was a lot, Paul uses his traumas to justify his place among the apostles, and that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense on the surface, but we're going to dive into exactly what we just read, starting with point 1, and that's no one is exempt from trauma. All right, so I said this earlier, and I didn't really have a lot to back me up then, but now I have a little bit more, so follow my logic here. All right, if anyone was going to be exempt from trauma, all right, wouldn't it have been the Apostle Paul? You know, the guy who boldly took the gospel into the world, who wrote most of the New Testament books, who, was just like the greatest Christian leader to ever live, right? Wouldn't it be him? If anyone was going to be exempt, wouldn't it be him? Wouldn't it be the guy who was just going out there and doing the work and constantly glorifying God and constantly chasing after God and trying everything he can to get the world to shift towards Jesus Christ? Wouldn't it be him? Because he wasn't exempt. Instead, he suffered insanely for the good news of Jesus, right? I mean, his traumas, and they were just, it was huge. It was a laundry list. And they mirror so many of the traumas that we face today too, right? So abuse, violent crime, catastrophe. Like, he suffered trauma just like traumas that we face today. Maybe not the same ones. I've never been shipwrecked. I nearly froze to death once. That's a trauma I've been through. I've never been shipwrecked. But that catastrophe, right? That's no one's fault. It just happened. So we have this sort of tie to Paul, and he wasn't exempt. If anyone was going to be exempt, it would have been him, but he wasn't, and we connect to him. So here's the thing. It's just clear that his effort and that his holiness weren't enough to separate him from the fact that bad, and not just bad, but bad things happen. And like I said, sometimes they're not people's fault. Being shipwrecked, it's probably not anyone's fault. At least 3 times, at maybe like 1 or 2, someone fell asleep at like the giant wheel, but like typically shipwrecking is not someone's fault, right? Some of them were definitely people's fault, like stoning or beating or whipping, right? Like those are definitely someone's fault. And all the forms of trauma that we kind of look at, like I said, Paul went through them. He wasn't exempt. But when he came to write, so even though he wasn't exempt, and when it came time to write his spiritual resume, he didn't rely on those things. He said it's foolish to brag about those things. It's foolish. He brought them up for a very specific reason, and it was only to challenge the people who were trying to take his authority, challenge the people who were trying to bring in false teaching and say, Paul's not even really the guy. Why are you guys following Paul? He's not even the dude. So no one's exempt from trauma, which means it's a stupid thing to brag about. Right? That's like bragging that you breathe. That's like bragging that you eat, that you drink water. Right? If trauma is part of the human experience, it's not something to brag about. Instead, we have something we can brag about, and that's victory. We have victory over our trauma because of Jesus Christ, which is the next point, right? So we decide that victory's there. You can have it. We decide if our trauma is useless or if it's purposeful. And that sounds really harsh, and it's really hard to wrap our heads around. And it sounds like I'm saying to you, be empathic, but then I'm going to say something like this, which is not empathic. But just hear me out, because I don't lack empathy. Paul went through everything he went through, but to brag about it to him was foolishness. He went through a lot of things, and he, in just one moment, he said, I'm not going to brag about this. Here's the list. He could have bragged about those things, and he calls it foolish. The only thing he brags about is his weakness. And the reason that he brags about his weakness is because it's Christ's strength, right? But he brags about his weakness, and trauma makes us feel weak. It makes us feel helpless. It takes our strength. It takes our willpower, and we're left to struggle with this situation. And sadly enough, there's a lot of times that just ends with suicide. And I have known so many people who have lost that battle. Because when you lose your strength and you lose your control, you lose your hope. Because on our own, without those things, what better choice is there? Paul brags about his weakness, and he brags about his weakness for a reason. And the reason is this: trauma is useless. It's harmful. And the problem is that what's typically done with useless and harmful things is we cast them out, we push them aside, we throw them away. But trauma doesn't work that way. If it was that easy, then we wouldn't deal with it, right? So like, if one of Micah's toys breaks, we throw it away. If we had lead paint in the house, we'd get rid of it. If something has no purpose, you throw it away. If something is harmful, you distance yourself. But trauma doesn't work that way. Trauma robs us of the things that we need to feel strong about. Like, we need to be secure in this, and we need to have strength, we need to have control. Trauma takes those things from us, and we're left with an option. So trauma is dark, it's difficult, and it seemingly has no purpose. But Paul finds a purpose. He says, the purpose is embracing your weakness. And when you embrace your weakness, you find something incredibly unexpected. And that's this. Our weakness is Christ's strength. Trauma produces weakness. It robs us of control. And make no mistake, trauma is bad. There's just no denying that. Trauma sucks. It sucks that people hurt each other. It sucks that circumstances become overwhelming and that they damage us. But what Paul found out about this profound weakness is that it's an access point. There's a promise associated with it. Jesus says, when you hit that weakness, that's when my power is made complete. Paul's long history of trauma, it could have caused him to become quite proud, but instead God gave him this thorn in the flesh. And the thorn in the flesh was his to struggle with, and it kept him grounded in his weakness. And thorn in the flesh is a weird phrase. I don't really know what it means. It's very descriptive, right? So it was something painful and like bothered him, right? I like to think of well, actually yesterday I was pulling out bushes at the house and there were thorns all over them. And I can picture that being an irritant, right? Or something that's constantly after you. And he prayed 3 times for God to take it away, and he didn't take it away. He said, no. Be content in your weakness, because my power is made perfect in weakness. So no one really knows exactly what Paul meant by thorn in the flesh. Some people think that he was blind. Some people think that he had like a physical deformity that kept him from being proud. Some people thought that he had like a recurrent sin issue that kept him from being proud. And I got to thinking about it. From this long list of traumas that he went through, I was wondering if maybe that thorn in the flesh, and this is just, look, no one knows, so it's worth hypothesizing about and having fun with. Maybe he was suffering some post-traumatic stress, right? Like maybe Paul had a PTSD issue from all of those. Seriously, if I went through all of those things, I would probably have some severe PTSD to deal with. So I wonder if maybe Paul got to a point where he was dealing with the struggle of PTSD. And without modern medicine and treatments and stuff, he would have horrible sleep, he would be frantic, he would have anxiety, hyper awareness, like all of those things that come with PTSD, he could have been suffering from as his thorn in the flesh. Just a thought, and that's maybe me reading it with Western eyes, or maybe me reading it as a veteran, or whatever, but it's something just to think about. It's kind of fun to pause it, just to play with it. But regardless, Paul was kept grounded in his weakness for a purpose, and that purpose was ultimately so he could have victory. It sounds so counterintuitive, it sounds so strange to say that his weakness is what caused him to have victory, but it's the promise that Christ gives. It says, when you're weak, that's when I have true strength in you. Christ's strength in our weakness is what brings us through our trauma. It delivers us through our trauma. And that means that our trauma presents a really unique opportunity to see Christ's strength in our lives, right? It brings us to this weak point. And like I said before, many people crack, and that's the end. But what I'm saying to you, Christian, to my unchristian friends, what I'm saying to you is there is a much better way to deal with trauma than to simply try to make it on your own strength, okay? In the Christian view, right, if you accept Christ as Lord, or Christians that you have accepted Christ as Lord, when you get to that point, you can say, God, in my weakness, I know you're strong and I trust you. And you get to that point, we're able to see that there's truly a purpose for everything we've gone through, every bit of pain, every bit of trauma, no matter how painful they are, no matter how dark they are, no matter how horrible they are, we find out that there's meaning when we allow them to magnify Christ in our lives. And that's how it was for Paul. Obviously, he carried the weight of those many circumstances. He was able to rattle them off. He remembered very specific things. But he carried something else along with that weight, which was Christ's strength. And that brings me to the next point. Christ's strength is our hope. There is no hope outside of the power that's made perfect in our weakness. Because if Christ's power is not made perfect in our weakness, then all we're left with is our weakness. So the power of Christ made perfect in our weakness is our hope. It's the only hope we have. Like I said, that's it. It's the only hope we have, and it's the most liberating thing we can experience. Imagine getting to the point where Christ's power in our trauma means that we're able to experience a purpose of our trauma. It gives us closure. It grants us a reason. It says that something terrible happened, and even though something terrible happened, we are able to excel past it, that we're able to glorify God, that we're able to magnify Christ, and more than that, that we're able to experience this healing, and we're able to experience God's love in our life through that power that's made perfect in our weakness. That is our hope. We trade in this heavy burden of trauma, and we take a much lighter one. That's what Jesus offers. In our weakness, we're transformed by Christ's power. In our weakness, we are equipped to show Christ's power to other people. Right? When someone knows you've gone through something terrible and you're able to say, no, in my weakness, Christ's power is made perfect, and you're able to show them that, and they're able to see Christ's power in your life, there is no more convincing testimony of the love of God than that. Christ's power in our weakness is our only hope. Over and over and over, Christ's power, it benefits us most when we're weak. And this seems like a good time to say it. Trauma does not mean that you're weak. When you went through what you went through, it wasn't because you're weak, right? Like Paul went through all of these things. A shipwreck, being flogged. I can't imagine being whipped 39 times, 5 times. Like, that's ridiculous. That is so much whipping. I can't even wrap my head around how much that would hurt, how much pain you'd be in. And after the first one, I'm not sure if I would keep going with being a missionary. I like to think that I would. In my heart, I like to think that I would. But then it's I don't know how many times I would be able to be whipped and keep going. Right? But he kept going. And to me, that makes him incredibly strong. Right? If you were shipwrecked and spent a day and a night out on the open water, and then you went back out on a boat, that makes you strong, right? But he doesn't boast about his strength. That's the difference, okay? Going through trauma, surviving your trauma, making it this far means that you are strong, but you don't have to continue on your own strength, because you're never going to overcome with that. And that's what he says. He says he's never going to overcome with that. If his reaction to trauma was to boast in his strength, he calls that foolishness. This guy who was traumatized again and again and again and again and again, he says, if I boast in my strength coming through all of those things, it is foolishness. So instead, he insists over and over, I will only boast in my weakness, because he found Christ's strength there. His entire sense of identity, is intrinsically tied to the work of Christ in his weakness, in his trauma, in his thorn in the flesh. And that's an opportunity that we share with him. That's something that we share with the Apostle Paul. All right, let's wrap it up. And I want to be clear. Trauma sucks. Trauma sucks. And there's nothing good about trauma in and of itself. The pain of traumatic experience, the lasting effects of that experience, like all the complications that come from experiencing something so extreme, they suck. They're terrible. And no one looks at trauma and is like, hey, I gotta get me some of that, right? Like, no one wants trauma. Trauma's terrible. But here's the thing. Trauma is not the only thing that sucks. Lots of things suck, right? Such an uplifting video this week. No, lots of things suck. But God can take any of those things and make them amazing. And he can and does redeem everything. Even the stuff that's so impossibly horrible that we could never picture it being redeemed. He redeems everything. And if you've experienced trauma, you're not defective. Even if you feel broken, you're not defective. You aren't less of a person than you were before your trauma. Even if you feel hopeless, even if you feel weak, Christ's power is made perfect in that, in your weakness, in your hopelessness, in your brokenness. Christ's liberating power is made perfect in that. Christ's victorious power is made perfect in that. Christ's transformative power is made perfect in that. Your trauma opens you up to experiencing things that you never could have experienced outside of that weakness if you choose to experience them. And that's it. That's it for this week. And that's it for our series on crisis. It has been such a healthy practice for me to talk about this stuff. I've experienced so much in this realm that it was really powerful. And I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I hope that you guys were built up from it. I hope that you just find hope in it. I hope that you find Jesus in it. There is nothing more important in these series than finding Jesus Christ. That's to my saved friends, my Christian friends, my non-Christian friends or not yet Christian friends. There is nothing more important than finding Jesus Christ in these situations. In your anxiety, in your self-hatred, in your depression, in your trauma. God loves you. He loves you in everything you've gone through, everything you're going through, and everything that you will go through is going to come around to show you his love in your life. That love is going to get into your life. God wants to redeem your crises by making something beautiful for you. And we want to help you experience that any way we can. We want to help you experience that. So thank you so much for joining us in this series. Next week, we're starting a new series. We're going to start a series based on the changing of the seasons. We're coming into fall. And so we're seeing a lot of general revelation, meaning creation, right? We're seeing a lot of general revelation showing us truth about life. And so we're going to explore some of those truths now in our next series, which I'm calling Autumn. So together, we're gonna explore those truths and try to find out a little bit more about God, a little bit more about Christ. We're gonna learn about hope and love, always. And we're gonna be transformed, and that's the key here. So listen, we love you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you leave a like, subscribe, all that stuff. And we will catch you guys again really soon. Thanks, guys.